So what direction is this country heading in? Is it wise to hold a general election right now? And are the Lib Dems going to gain along with the Brexit party? Or the two main stable parties of the Labour and the Conservatives carry on as normal, holding most of the seats in Parliament? Well, it's an extremely complicated picture, and I've taken the three most recent by-elections in the UK, they've all happened this year, to show you just exactly what is going on. And if you like this kind of in-depth analytics where I get really nerdy about Brexit or elections, let me know by hitting that subscribe button. So the Newport by-election happened in April. It was when the Labour MP Paul Flynn died, and Labour held on to the seat. They got the biggest vote share with 39.6% of the vote share, followed by the Conservatives. The Brexit party weren't around yet, so UKIP gained the third biggest vote share, followed by all the Remain parties, because the Remain vote was split amongst those three parties. The Peterborough by-election took place on the 6th of June. We'd already have the European elections and the local elections by this point, so the Brexit party was still around. It was after the MP was recalled for breaching the course of justice, and even though, despite the fact that the MP was recalled, Labour held on to the seat with 30.9% of the vote share. The Brexit party came a close second with 28.9%. The Conservatives third on 21.4%. The Liberal Democrats fourth with 12.3%. And the Greens with 3.1%. So by now, two things had happened. One, the Brexit party had well established itself in British politics in place of UKIP. UKIP were no longer around. Two, the Remain parties continued to succeed. And three, the mainstream parties, Labour and the Conservatives, didn't do as well as expected or that they could have done. Even though Fiona Onasanya and the scandal surrounding her driving offences was a massive scandal for the Labour Party, along with anti-Semitism, along with their ambiguity surrounding Brexit, they still won the seat. We'll come on to that later. And then, most recently, we've had the Brecon and Radnorshire election, where the Lib Dems gained from the Conservatives after the Conservative MP, who stood again in the Conservative seat, by the way, whereas the Labour MP in the Peterborough election did not stand again. So the Conservative MP stood again and lost the seat. So Lib Dems had 43.46% of the vote share. The Conservatives had 39.98% of the vote share. The Brexit party had 10.47%. And Labour on fourth place with 5.28% of the vote share. So looking at who's holding and who's gaining, you might think that it's therefore going to be Labour and the Lib Dems in the next general election, unless the Tories can somehow pull off Brexit and take away vote share from the Brexit party to gain seats. But there's a couple of things to note here. One, the Conservative vote share declined between Newport in April and Peterborough in June, but then they came back into second place for the Brecon election. Two, the Labour vote share hasn't been that great above the second place candidate, even when they won the seat. And three, the Lib Dem vote share has been overall quite good, along with the Brexit party / UKIP. And that was played out in the vote share changes per constituency. The other thing to note, of course, is the fact that the voter turnout has actually gone up. People have become more enthused about voting in these by-elections, not less enthused. Perhaps because we've now got a brand new Prime Minister in Boris Johnson. And also it's worth noting that these are three very different areas of the country, three very different histories in terms of who's normally their MP and whether it's a swing seat or not. But the pattern amongst vote share changes, you'll see from the bottom, is that Labour and the Conservatives are the biggest losers. Newport, Labour lost 12.7% of the vote share. Peterborough, they lost a whopping 17.6% of the vote share. And Brecon's 12.42% of the vote share. The Conservatives, despite having Boris Johnson now in power, lost 8% in Newport, 25.45% in Peterborough, and 9.62% in Brecon. Now, the loss in vote share might be as a result of the candidates rather than the Prime Minister, or even the history of the by-election itself, as opposed to when we have a general election, it becomes about more nationwide topics as opposed to local issues. So, for example, the Fiona Onasanya scandal would have affected the Labour vote share in Peterborough. On the other hand, of course, Labour and Conservative losses is consistent with the results of the local elections and the European elections. The other thing that's equally consistent with those elections is the Brexit Party / UKIP gains and the Remainer Party gains. So UKIP 6.1% in Newport, Brexit Party 28.9% because they're brand new in Peterborough, and 10.47% because they're brand new in Brecon. Again, the Lib Dems 2.4% in Newport, 8.92% in Peterborough. So big gains for the parties on the Brexit issues. The other thing to know about these three individual constituencies is the difference between the national opinion of these parties versus the individual constituencies' opinion of these parties. So, for example, in Newport, which voted 54% to leave the European Union, the biggest difference between national polling at the time and the result itself in Newport made sure that Labour were the biggest unexpected winners in Newport. They had the most success in that constituency compared to the national picture in general. With a party so ambiguous on the Brexit issue, part of the party is in favour of remaining in the EU, the other half of the party is in favour of leaving the EU with a kind of customs union deal. Why is it that in Newport, in particular, Labour did better than the national polling average? Well, it's quite simple really. The MP in Newport died. There's no fault or blame or scandal to be pointed towards Labour, in particular in a Newport by-election. And so the Labour Party did better than the overall national picture in Newport. Likewise, in a Leave constituency, UKIP did better than the overall national polling at the time. Meanwhile, the Conservatives, the Lib Dems and the Greens all did worse, partly because this is a Leave constituency, so the Remainer parties aren't going to do as well. Partly because Theresa May was very unpopular back in April, so the Conservatives aren't going to do as well in this constituency, which is a Labour seat anyway. It's not like the rural parts of the south where the Conservatives might do better than the national polling average. In Peterborough, 61% Leave favouring constituency. The party that did the best when compared to national polling at the time was the Brexit Party, unsurprisingly, 10.79% above their national polling average. So the Brexit Party doing well in Leave constituencies, but also, quite surprisingly, the Labour Party doing slightly better than the national polling average at the time. Probably because Lisa Forbes herself was a popular candidate to take over from Fiona Onasanya. All the other parties doing much worse. UKIP because of the Brexit Party, the Conservatives because of Theresa May, and the Remain parties because it's a Leave constituency. Brecon is a slightly more marginal Leave percentage in the EU referendum. 52% of them voted to leave the EU. And so, the Lib Dems are the biggest dark horses when compared to the national polling average at the time. So they vote to leave the EU, and yet a Remain party is doing much better, 27.46% better than the national average at the time. Why could this be? Well, this is a constituency with a history of Liberal wins. There was a Liberal candidate that won it in 2010. It was then taken over by Chris Davies, and of course this whole scandal around his expenses is why we're having this by-election in the first place. So really, this is a constituency where the two main candidates are between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party. And so the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives are doing better than the national average. Now, the Liberal Democrats are doing much better than the Conservatives because it was a Conservative seat. The scandal that caused the by-election was a Conservative issue, and so the Liberal Democrats are gaining from the Conservatives in this particular seat. But the Conservatives are still doing better than the national average at 9.98%. Doing worse, however, are the Brexit Party, lower than the national average at 4.53%. Perhaps that's proof that this is a marginal constituency, but also it's proof that perhaps the Brexit Party aren't doing as well as they could be because of Boris Johnson. And then Labour doing much, much worse than the national average in this seat, minus 24.72%. So I would stress, never take an individual result as a projection for a future general election. Because as this shows, it all depends who's voting, where they're voting, what issues they're voting on, and what options they have to vote for. So not all constituencies, for example, had the Green Party and Plaid Cymru and other Remain parties in their voting ballot paper. And so that's why Brecon in itself, the Lib Dems did so well, because the Plaid and the Greens decided to pull out to support Remain parties. But also not everybody votes on the Brexit issue. Not everybody votes on party policy. Some people vote because they think their candidate will win, and therefore, say a general election, if they vote Conservative or Labour, they know they're voting for the next government. But having said that, Brexit is playing a huge role in voting at the moment. If we take all three by-elections and average out the changes, it's pretty obvious that Labour would lose 14% of the vote share, the Conservatives similar 14%. Of course, that might change now that Boris Johnson's in power in constituencies where the Conservative candidate is a bit more popular. That might rise a bit. But also Remain parties like the Lib Dems, 8.56 doing well. The Brexit Party / UKIP doing well, 11.2%. And the Greens, of course, doing well as well. So it all depends whether or not the Brexit Party and the Conservatives team up, because they will lose a lot of vote share between each other. And it all depends whether the Remain parties, Plaid, the Greens, and the Lib Dems team up, because again, they will lose a lot of vote share between each other. But what about Labour? Who's going to vote for them? Well, before we get into that, there is a by-election coming up in Sheffield Hallam. Now, Sheffield Hallam voted 34% to leave the EU, 66% to remain. In 2017, they were Labour. In 2015, they were Lib Dem. In 2010, they were Lib Dem. 2005, they were Lib Dem. It's all Nick Clegg. So you'd expect Sheffield Hallam, being a Remain constituency, to go towards the Lib Dems, based on that kind of history and the Brexit issue. Especially given this Peterborough result, it's had kind of similar numbers, but the opposite way round. So you might expect some kind of 10.79% vote share or something around there for the Lib Dems in Sheffield Hallam. So just to show you what's up for grabs, in 2016 in the EU referendum, there were 291 seats that voted over 55% to leave the EU. Now, of Leave voters, no matter where they're from, the vote share was broken up. So 65% of Leave voters voted for the Conservative Party in 2017. 24% voted for the Labour Party. 5% voted for others. 4% voted for UKIP. And 2% voted for the Lib Dems. So if you remember, in 2017, it was kind of assumed that Brexit was kind of done and over with. So UKIP didn't perhaps do as well as the Brexit Party would do in a future election. But also this shows that there are 24% of 291, so there's roughly 24% or 70 seats worth of seats with over 55% majorities for leaving the EU, and 189 Conservative seats with over 55% majorities for leaving the EU. Now that could be broken up into the Brexit Party if we fail to leave the EU on the 31st of October. As for the Remain seats, well, it was Labour that gained the most out of the Remain vote. So 54% of Remain voters voted for the Labour Party. If you break up the seats that voted under 45% to leave the EU, so over 55% to remain in the EU, then you're talking about 87 seats roughly of Remainer seats. 26% of Remain voters voted for the Conservative Party. Of course, the Lib Dems do very well in this category with over 13% of that vote share, and others taking 7%. So expect the Lib Dems to eat into this Remainer vote share. But as for the marginal seats, those are the seats that voted between 55% to leave the EU and 55% to remain in the EU, or 45% to leave the EU. Then, overwhelmingly, out of people that did not vote in the European election, the Labour Party have shown to be the best. So you can imagine, out of the people that did not vote in the European election, as in they don't care, or they didn't get time to, or whatever, if they show up to these marginal leave seats or remain seats, the Labour Party has a potential of gaining 130 seats from these marginal seats if they can break through on other issues. So don't expect the Labour Party to automatically do poorly just because of Brexit. It all depends whether Brexit gets delivered and what the situation of the next election happens to be. The Conservative Party doing worse with 23% of do not voters. Others get 6%. The Lib Dems get 4%, and UKIP get 1%. Now, it's worth mentioning that perhaps the people who did not vote in the EU election but voted in the 2017 election happens to be a much smaller number of people, and therefore a smaller number of votes, also people that might not turn up to a future election, than these strong Remain and Leave voters. So that perhaps explains why the Labour Party has sided more towards their red areas in these Remain seats as opposed to their red areas in these Leave seats. But as these colours show, if you replace this purple with the turquoise of the Brexit Party, that has the potential of growing massively, along with this yellow of the Lib Dems. It all depends whether Brexit gets delivered or not. If it doesn't get delivered, you can expect the Lib Dems and the Brexit Party to grow. If it does, I'd expect other issues to take over, and depending on how it's framed, perhaps the Labour Party could do well, or perhaps the Conservatives under Boris Johnson could do well. As you can see, the country is very divided. It's a very complicated picture. It all depends whether you're voting on independence issues or Brexit issues or nationalisation issues or tax issues or economic issues or anything like that. And it depends what you're showing up to the voting booth for and where you're showing up to that voting booth, and also what the turnout is and who already holds that seat, for example. But the biggest factor in the next election is going to be whether Brexit gets delivered or not. As always, join in the debate below and subscribe.